Everyone knows why certain crops took over the world. They won because they were the best food. More calories from the same patch of ground, easier storage, better bread, so farmers everywhere came around to them in the end. And the map of what the world eats is really just a map of what works. Take seed from a maize field in southern Mexico, a variety that has grown in those valleys for thousands of years, and plant it in Iowa. It comes up fine. It grows fast. It keeps growing. Past head height, past 3 meters, greener and taller than anything in the next field over. And by the time autumn arrives, it has still not made a single ear of corn. The frost kills it standing. Nothing is wrong with that seed. It is not old or weak or badly stored. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do, in a place where doing it is fatal. The plant is waiting for a signal, and in an Iowa summer, that signal never comes. The signal is darkness. A great many crop plants decide when to flower by measuring the length of the night. Agronomists call this photoperiod sensitivity, which sounds technical and means something plain. The plant counts hours of dark, and when the nights get long enough, it stops making leaves and starts making seed. Near the equator, that clock is dependable because the difference between the longest and the shortest day of the year is barely an hour. Move the same plant far north into a summer where the sun is up for 15 or 16 hours and the clock never strikes. So, the plant grows leaves, then more leaves. It becomes a green tower with nothing edible on it, and the season closes over the top of it. The first time I read that a maize plant in the wrong latitude simply keeps growing, I assumed it was a gardener's exaggeration. It is not. Plant breeders deal with it every year, and there are experiment stations in the northern United States where tropical maize is grown deliberately, knowing it will never ripen, purely to get at the genes inside it. There is a version of this story that is wrong, though, and it is worth killing before it takes hold. Weather did not pick crops the way a shopper picks fruit off a shelf. People moved plants, and people had reasons that had nothing to do with sunlight. Taste, tax law, ritual, what a state could store, count, and seize, what a plantation could sell. Europe kept its distance from the potato for the better part of 2 centuries while the crop sat there quietly being the better source of calories. Rice took hold in the Carolinas partly because enslaved West Africans already knew how to grow it, which is a fact about people, not about rainfall. Climate did something narrower and harder than choosing. It decided which crops were allowed on the board at all. Inside those limits, human beings argued, traded, taxed, and starved their way to a decision. But outside them, nothing was negotiable, because a plant that cannot finish flowering and filling its grain before the cold or the drought arrives produces nothing whatsoever, and no market, army, or emperor has ever found a way around that. 2 clocks set those limits. The first is the one already described, night length. The second is heat. Crops need a certain accumulated amount of warmth to get from seed to ripe grain, a quantity farmers now measure as growing degree days, which is really just the total of how warm each day was, added up across the season. A short, cool summer supplies less of it, push a crop past the line where the season stops supplying enough, and the plant does not shrink politely, it fails. Maize shows what that looks like across thousands of years. The crop was domesticated in the Balsas River Valley of southwest Mexico around 9,000 years ago, a date built largely on microscopic evidence, the starch grains, and the tiny silica shapes called phytoliths that plants leave in soil and on tools, work associated above all with Dolores piperno. From there, it traveled. Southward, it moved quickly down into South America because the day lengths it met on the way were close enough to the ones it already knew. Northward, it crawled. By around 4,000 years ago, maize had reached the lowland deserts of what is now the southwestern United States, and there it took hold fast. Then it stopped. For roughly 2,000 more years, it made almost no headway into the cooler uplands just above those deserts, a gap that puzzled archaeologists for a long time because there was no obvious barrier, no mountain range, no hostile frontier. The people up there farmed. They knew the crop existed. They simply could not make it work. In 2017, a team led by Kelly Swartz published a genetic answer in the journal Science. They sequenced 15 maize cobs about 1900 years old, recovered from turkey pin shelter on the Colorado Plateau in southeastern Utah. The cobs already carried variants for earlier flowering, and the plants they came from were short and heavily tillering, throwing up extra side shoots. But the analysis put those plants at only marginally adapted, sitting right on the edge of what that upland season could support. Crucially, the adaptation had not been imported ready-made from Mexico. It had been assembled on the spot, out of variation already present in the seed, by generations of farmers doing the only thing available to them. Picture that work, because it is not dramatic and it took centuries. A plot on the plateau in late summer. The plants are uneven, some barely knee-high, some tall. A handful have set ears that are hardening, most have not. Frost is coming, and everything still soft will be lost. The farmer walks the rows and takes seed from the plants that finished, the early ones, the small ones, the ones a modern eye would call disappointing, and sets that seed aside for the following spring. Do that for 20 generations of plants and the field starts to look different. Do it for 200 and you have a new crop. I could not find a source that settles whether those farmers understood what they were selecting for, whether anyone thought in terms of the sun at all, or simply kept seed from what worked. The evidence gives us the outcome and stays silent on the intention. Once that problem was solved, the geography of North America changed shape. Recent radiocarbon modeling of sites across the plains and the Northeast shows maize spreading east and north relatively quickly after temperate adaptation existed, arriving as a usable crop rather than an experiment. The maize that finally worked in the north was smaller, hardier, and lower yielding than the maize it came from, with fewer rows of larger flint hard kernels. That was the point. It gave up size in exchange for finishing early, and finishing early was the only currency that mattered. By the time European ships were working the northeastern coast, maize was growing in fields at latitudes matching northern France in a form nobody had seen in the Caribbean. Short plants, hard, glassy kernels, often 8 rows to a cob. That northern flint maize later crossed with southern types to help produce the varieties behind the American Corn Belt, and it exists at all because a long chain of farmers on the Colorado Plateau and the plains kept seed from whatever beat the frost. Geneticists have since found part of the switch itself. A region on maize chromosome 10, carrying a gene now labeled ZMCCT, sits close to the center of the day-length response, and work published by Hung and colleagues in 2012 tied variation there to the crop's spread after domestication. Later surveys found a small set of early flowering variants rising sharply in frequency, exactly as maize pushed into the northern United States. Nobody in those fields knew a chromosome existed. They were keeping the plants that ripened, and the genes rode along underneath. The same clock was ticking on the other side of the world, and there, a state solved the problem by shopping. In 1012, a severe drought hit the Yangtze and Huai River valleys, and the Song Emperor Zhenzong sent envoys to Fujian province to obtain seed of a rice that had arrived there from Champa, a kingdom in what is now central Vietnam. 30,000 bushels of it were distributed to the drought-struck districts, along with printed instructions on how to grow it, since the variety was unfamiliar. That detail is one of my favorites in the whole episode. An 11th century government mass-producing a pamphlet because the seed alone was not enough. Champa rice had 3 properties worth an emperor's attention. It tolerated drought. It ripened fast, in something closer to 100 days than the 150 or more that most tropical rices then needed. And it was not photoperiod sensitive, meaning it ripened on its own internal schedule instead of waiting for the nights to lengthen. That third property is the one that rarely gets mentioned and does most of the work. A rice that ignores day length can be sown when the farmer chooses rather than when the calendar allows, which opens the door to 2 harvests a year in places that had managed 1, and to fields on higher, drier ground that had never carried rice at all. The trade-off was real, and the sources are honest about it. Champa rices were reported to yield less than the established varieties at first, and to eat worse, lower in gluten and less reliable in storage. Farmers took them anyway in the places where a fast, drought-tolerant crop that could be squeezed in beside another was worth more than a better bowl of rice. What spread was not the finest rice available. It was the rice that fitted into a gap in the calendar. The historian Ho Ping Ti made the strong version of this argument in the 1950s, tying early ripening rice to the surge in southern Chinese population that followed. Not everyone accepts the weight he put on it. Other scholars point out that Champa varieties gave lower yields at first and were considered worse eating, that other early ripening rices spread alongside them and may have mattered more, and that no one is even certain when Champa rice first reached Fujian, with some placing it as early as the 8th century. My own read is that the timing of 10 to 12 is real and well documented, and the century-by-century economic effect is a reconstruction, argued rather than measured, and should be described that way. 800 years later, the same trick was pulled in the coldest wheat country on earth. Red Fife was the standard spring wheat of Canada, excellent in the mill and the bakery, and late. In Western Canada, it kept meeting autumn frost while still standing in the field, and a frozen crop was a ruined crop. William Saunders, running the Dominion Experimental Farms, imported wheats from Russia, India, Japan, and Australia to test alongside it. One of them, a mixed Indian material sold under the name Hard Red Calcutta, ripened around 3 weeks earlier than Red Fife. It also yielded poorly and made bad bread. His son, Percy, crossed the two in 1892. Another son, Charles, spent years pulling a single reliable line out of the mess that followed. And his method of testing baking quality was to pick a few kernels from a selected head and chew them into a ball of dough in his mouth, judging the gluten by feel, because he had no mill and no oven. Picture that winter. An office in Ottawa, snow outside, a row of numbered paper packets on a desk, a man working through a season's harvest one mouthful at a time and spitting each verdict into a note. The field testing was slower still. Seed from the promising lines went west to the experimental farm at Indian Head in Saskatchewan, where Angus McKay grew it in the kind of season it would actually have to survive, and reported that it ripened first and yielded best. Stations in the gentler east reported almost no advantage at all, which is precisely what a trait that only pays where the frost arrives early should look like. The line Charles settled on was named Marquis. It went out to farmers in 1909. It ripened roughly a week to 10 days sooner than Red Fife and kept the bread quality. And by 1920, something like 90% of the wheat grown in Western Canada was Marquis. 7 days. That is the entire margin, and it moved the northern edge of Canadian wheat farming hundreds of kilometers. This is where a famous argument usually enters, and it deserves handling carefully. Jared Diamond proposed in 1997 that Eurasia's east to west shape gave it an enormous head start because a crop traveling east or west stays in familiar day lengths and seasons, while a crop traveling north or south through the Americas or Africa hits a new climate every few hundred kilometers and has to be rebuilt. Archaeologists and geographers have pushed back on how much that single fact explains, pointing to trade, disease, population size, and plain historical accident. The reading I find more convincing sits in the middle. The axis argument is clearly right about the mechanism, and the Maize story is close to a controlled demonstration of it. As a full explanation for who ended up ruling whom, it carries far more weight than the evidence supports. Which brings us to the part that reframes everything before it. The crops that dominate the modern world are not the most nutritious plants humanity found, and in many cases, they are not even the highest yielding in their own homelands. They are the ones whose leash was cut. Every crop on that short list has been deliberately freed from the constraints that used to pin it to one band of latitude. And the clearest case is the one that made the Green Revolution possible. Norman Borlaug, working in Mexico from the 1940s, did something his colleagues considered reckless. Instead of breeding wheat in one place, he shuttled his seed between two, a hot irrigated lowland site in Sonora in the north and a cool highland site near Toluca in the south, growing 2 generations a year in environments that differed in latitude, altitude, and rainfall. The intent was speed. The side effect was that only lines indifferent to all those differences survived the process, which meant lines carrying the genes for photoperiod insensitivity, the same trait Champa rice had. Combined with dwarfing genes that had come to him from a Japanese wheat, the result was a plant that could be shipped to India, Pakistan, or Turkey and simply grow without a decade of local rebreeding first. That claim also has a critical literature attached to it. The historian Marcy Baranski has argued that the doctrine of wide adaptation was oversold, that Borlaug defended it with average results, and that the varieties performed far better on irrigated, fertilized land than on the rain-fed fields where most poor farmers actually worked. Both things can hold at once. The wheat really did travel, and that the reason it traveled was not that it was the best wheat, but that it was the wheat that had stopped asking what latitude it was standing in. Now look at the crops that never got that treatment. Sorghum and pearl millet landraces across the Sahel are strongly photoperiod sensitive, and there this is a virtue rather than a defect, since the plants time their flowering to the end of the rainy season, no matter when they were sown, which protects the grain from rotting in the last downpours. That precision is worth a great deal in Mali and worth nothing in Manitoba. Fonio ripens in weeks and carries West African households through the hungry gap before the main harvest. Teff grows on the Ethiopian highlands and makes a bread nothing else quite reproduces. These are not failed crops. They are crops that were never unhooked, and so they stayed exactly where the weather put them. The result is on the plate today. Colin Curie and colleagues, working with 50 years of national food supply data, found that diets around the world have grown roughly a third more similar to one another since the 1960s, converging on a small set of truly global plants. Wheat is now a significant staple in over 97% of countries, rice in 91. 50 crop commodities account for around 90% of the calories in the world's food supply, while millets, sorghum, rye, cassava, yams, and sweet potato have all lost ground. Every bakery, noodle stall, and tortilla press on earth is drawing on the same short list. That list looks like triumph, and it is also the exposure. A world eating a handful of species is a world where one disease, one heat wave, or one bad decade in a single growing region reaches everybody. And the constraint that all this engineering was built to escape has started moving on its own, because the climate zones the varieties were tuned to are shifting faster than a breeding program runs. Seed banks are now going back to exactly the crops that stayed regional, the drought-hardened sorghums and the season-sensitive millets, looking for traits that were never valuable enough to keep until the weather changed its mind. 50 crops supply nearly all the calories in the world's food supply. Wheat is a staple in 97 of every 100 countries, rice in 91. Those are recent numbers, and they describe a short list of plants that were each taught one variety at a time to stop asking what season it is.